Great, let's continue building our first real-world application. Until now, we've defined the user interface, and in fact this is the user interface for our application. We have a very simple labeling here indicating that we should set the date in here. We have this date picker in which we've changed its mode for it to show only date and not the time as well. We also have a button here which is going to allow the user to calculate the date between today and the date entered in the date picker. And finally, there's another label for us to show the result. Great, so back in Xcode, the first thing that we should do, if you remember of course, is to link every single element from the user interface that we would like to use from the code directly to the viewController.swift. To do that, it's easy enough for us to go to the assistant editor, and I'm just going to hide those parts of the UI so I have more space in here to link the interface. And of course, the first thing that we need to link is the date picker. So if you remember, it's just Control click drag to the view controller, and because we don't need an event right now, we only need to access the outlet itself. I'm just going to leave the connection as outlet, and I'm going to name this date picker. Perfect. The next thing that I want to link is the label in which we are going to show the amount of days. Again, this is going to be an outlet, and I'm going to call this days label. And finally, what I like to link is the button. But again, we don't need to access the attributes of the button. All we need is to know when it is pressed. So I'm going to link it to the bottom of the page, and I'm going to change the connection type to action. Because what I want to do is not access the attributes of the button, but access a particular event. In this case, I'm going to leave touch-up inside as the event that is going to trigger this function. And finally, I am going to name this action. I'm going to name it calculate button underscore pressed. Okay. And I believe that's everything. That's everything we need to link between our user interface and the code. So I'm going to head back to the standard editor, and I'm going to move to the viewController.swift, in which we of course have all the code that we just added. And in the calculate button underscore pressed action is where we would like to do two things, or rather three things. First of all, and I'm going to add a comment here, get the date from date picker, like that. Once we have a date, we need to calculate days between dates, you know, today and the date in the date picker. And finally, assign value to label. So in the label, we should write whatever date we have calculated earlier. Great, so let's do this step by step. Let's first create a new variable, which I'm going to call selected date. And we have to assign it to the date that has been selected in the date picker. So I have to access the date picker, and the date picker has a date attribute, which will allow me to know which date the user has selected from the date picker. And that's it. The first step is done. Let's move on to the second step. Now, in the second step, there are going to be two steps. First of all, we need to get the current date. So I'm going to create another variable, which I'm going to call current date. And to get the current date, it's as easy as initializing a new NSDate. NSDate is going to be the type of both current date, selected date, and in fact, it's also the type of date, of course, because we're assigning it to selected date. Now, current date by itself, by just initializing NSDate, has the current date. The next thing to do would be to calculate the days between the current date and the selected date. To do that, the first thing that we're going to need is a calendar. So I'm going to create another variable which I'm going to call calendar. And this is going to be equal to nsCalendar dot current calendar. And this calendar is going to help us calculate the days between one date and the other thanks to its components. And you'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. First, I need to define a constant, which I'm going to call components, because it is going to be the calendar's component. So I'm going to access the calendar's components. And as you can see, I'm going to use this method. First, it needs an nsCalendar unit. So I'm going to give it an nsCalendar calendar unit dot day calendar unit. From date, which date? The current date. To date, which date? The selected date. Selected date, like that. And I'm not going to give any options, so I'm just going to call it nil. And in fact, that's going to be it. I am going to need, of course, another constant just to have the amount of numbers of days. And the amount of days is going to be in the components dot day. And now the amount of days should have the amount of days between the current date and the selected date. And finally, if everything is correct, we should be able to assign that amount of days, which in fact is going to be an integer, to the label. Of course, we cannot just give the label's text an integer, so we need to convert it to string in a way. Anyways, we need to access the days label.text, and we need to assign a string to it. The easy way to do it is to use the string class, and in one of all of its constructors or initializers, it has one that converts an integer to a string. So all I need to do is set the amount of days in here, and the string class is going to be responsible of converting that amount of days, which is an integer, to text. Okay, the time of the truth is here. We have to test this and make sure that everything's worked correctly. I'm going to run this, and I'm going to head back to the simulator, and we should be able to set a date, press the button calculate, and see the amount of days between that date and today. For example, this is today's date. I will move it to the 18th, which is 2 days from now. I'm going to set calculate, and it says 1. Well, why does it set 1? Is because it starts counting in 0. Because from today to tomorrow, there's not really an entire day left. Because it's already, in this case, 7:50 p.m. So from today to tomorrow, there's not really an entire day. So you only start counting 1 until it's more than a day to that. So if I go all the way to the 2nd of August of 2016, and we calculate it, that's the amount of days from today to then plus 1. So we are going to change something very easy to the code for it to work a little bit better, for it to show the amount of days exactly. So I'm just going to add this in the definition of amount of days. I'm going to just add 1 to the days, to the component's day, like this, and that should be enough. So I'm going to run this one more time, And you can ignore this. You know, every programmer ignores every alert unless it's red, but yellow is okay. So if I now set this to 18, I now get 2. But I don't know if you noticed at the beginning, I had 0 days. And when I set it to calculate, it's only 2. It's not saying 2 days. And that is just simple because we are only assigning to the text of the label the amount of days. We have to add to that string the days worth so it has a more continuous UI. And that is just as easy as what we've done here with the +1. All we need is set plus and some string here with a space so it's not all together, and days. And let's just stop this and run it one more time, and it should be working perfectly now. So I will go to a place, a time far from now, calculate, and there we go, 8,205 days.